and a more livable planet. My name is Todd Eisenstadt. I'm a professor of government at American University and the director of research at the Center for Environmental Policy. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here, especially those of you who waited and endured our technical difficulties. And I want to thank my colleagues, panelists today for also weathering the storm, and to colleagues at American University who've helped us fix this. Thank you also. I believe I am sharing my screen, which is a good thing. And I would like to start a very quick presentation. Although I can't see my screen. Am I sharing my screen, guys?
We can see it.
Okay. You can see it. I can't see it. Okay, I can see. Okay, thank you. All right. Today we're talking about whether international leadership in climate diplomacy. This is the first of 5 presentations, and I think I'm going to skip right to the point, since I mean this was to talk about sort of some of the very highly negative effects of climate change, such as after Hurricane Maria on the island of Dominica, which suffered 250% GDP damage. The damage was equal to 2.5 years of economic production of the island. You know, we have some optimistic signs. Solar energy is getting much cheaper. Battery storage is getting much cheaper. The way forward is becoming apparent. And this series is to try and help demarcate some of the ways forward for decarbonization and hopefully the path to zero emissions. Okay, and that path for our panelists today starts with the Paris Agreement, which was reached in late 2015 and went into effect shortly afterwards. As Bogart and Bergman will tell us from Casablanca, we'll always have Paris. Paris has some strengths and some weaknesses. Very quickly, just to say that it is a very inclusive agreement, and it helped a lot of nations overcome some internal dissent in order to participate and to make pledges for emissions reductions. It does have a way to increase the ambition that is set out in the Paris Agreement. The problem with the Paris Agreement is that that ambition is perhaps not fully present at this time. That is to say that if the scientists who work at the IPCC, which is a body that consults and advises the United Nations, if those scientists put forth a needed path of cuts in emissions to reach 1.5 degree ceiling on climate change by the end of this century, we are presently on course, according to Climate Interactive, which is a very good online modeling system for this. We're on course for about double that amount of warming of the climate. In the US, which I'm going to speak of ever so briefly, we are back on track with the election of President Biden, who strongly supports the climate change agenda that was really started by his predecessor in the Democratic Party, Barack Obama. President Trump has left the scene, but left but not forgotten, I'm sure. But for the time being, we are back in the position of planning comprehensive climate change legislation and implementation. In fact, President Biden joined the Paris Agreement at the very beginning of his administration after President Trump immediately left that agreement. The United States was the first country to leave the Paris Agreement, which was rather embarrassing to many of us because, in fact, the United States helped negotiate the agreement. President Biden, however, is in a squeeze. That is to say, he has on the left, he's a centrist. So he has on the progressive side, he has the Green New Deal advocates who wish to really upend a lot of the infrastructure that exists for delivery of energy in the US. He wants, those advocates, including several members of the US Congress, prominent members, wish to upgrade every building, wish to modernize the transportation infrastructure for electric cars and rails, want to change the entire energy grid to renewables, and indeed seek to have zero emissions by 2050. On his right, on the conservative side, President Biden has many of the Republican Party, not all. Some Republicans have supported climate change in the past and continue to do so, but former President Trump's loyalists, who have constituted about 30% of the US population regularly and more than that in the US Senate, that group has sought to continue extensively deregulating coal and fracking, continue strong fossil fuel subsidies, and former President Trump's Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which was a way of ending President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which sought to reduce emissions through state utilities and through the enforcement by the Environmental Protection Agency with a new interpretation of earlier legislation by the EPA. That effort to increase regulation by President Obama was derailed by President Trump, but it could be revisited, and it could be presented in some other guise now by President Biden. It is also important to say that there's international actors that are confronting President Biden. He has had, based on President Trump's relations with China, for example, the world's largest emitter, President Biden has inherited some trade conflicts, and there are some new building security conflicts, perhaps between the two countries, over what the US has perceived as some Chinese territorial ambitions in the South China Sea and other controversies that exist between those two nations. Many fear that the agenda on security and trade issues may jeopardize the climate cooperation that exists between the US and China, at least, or could exist, that could be starting again as it existed earlier, especially under President Obama. So it seems that the US and China may be able to try to renew collaboration. President Obama and Chinese President Xi Jinping reached a bilateral agreement, which some view as perhaps a kind of climate club beginning, a solution between high emitting nations that might bypass the United Nations, where the General Assembly requires a consensus agreement by all nations. If small numbers of nations, of large emitting nations, cooperate and set their own targets for reducing emissions, it may be that that is another forum for delivering on emissions reductions internationally. So the question is whether China and the US, which in about 2019 accounted for 43% of total emissions, could perhaps integrate also the third largest emitter, which is India, and hence account for about half the world's emissions in a group that could consider reducing emissions unilaterally, that is, as a group of three, as opposed to the United Nations. And of course, we also have a guest speaker today from Germany, also representing the flagship economy of the European Union, which has been, we would have to say, an undisputed leader in worldwide climate change advocacy, at least since the 1990s. And so it seems that we have a good set of questions to ask today. And I just would show you in conclusion of this quick discussion, some 2019 total emissions by country as reported by the Union of Concerned Scientists in the US. And Miranda can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that total EU combined emissions are about 7% of worldwide emissions. But the number, I guess the exact number is remains to be identified. I'll leave that for now, but just say that we are very fortunate today to have with us speakers representing some of these most important international actors. And I would like to pass the Zoom platform now to our first guest, Ryna Yiyun Cui, who's an assistant research professor and the China program co-director at the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is an expert on global coal transition and climate and energy policies in China. And she leads the Global Coal Transition Project at the Center for Global Sustainability, focusing on rapid coal phase-outs globally and in key countries of interest. We're very glad to have her, and thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Todd, for the introduction. I'm about to share my screen. I do have a few slides. Hope it looks good on everyone's screen. Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to be able to share some of our work and thoughts on China's climate action and also the long-term low carbon strategies for China. And I think this is really a great series of events that AU are putting together. And I think thank you for inviting me. So my talk today will focus on some of the opportunities and challenges of reaching net zero emissions in China. And I'm pulling together some of the work we did at the Center for Global Sustainability China program in the past year or so. So I just want to start by refreshing everyone's memory about the China's climate pledges to the international community. And also in parallel, what China is own vision about the development goal for the country itself. So I think there are two main pieces on the international climate pledges: peaking emission, keeping carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 in the near term, and reaching carbon neutrality before 2060. That's kind of on the long-term timeline. And in parallel, on the domestic side, China have two kind of a similar near and long-term vision along those lines, reaching basic modernization and beautiful China by 2035, and delivering a full developed and rich and powerful nation by around mid of the century. There are some other more detailed elements about the NDC. I think this is a really nice table I pull out from China Dialogue they put together. I think you can see there's some more ambitious target that was updated in 2020 last year compared to where it initially submitted in 2015. But also the last column kind of showing where we are as of 2019. So you can see what needs to be done within the next 10 years or so to achieve the 2020 target. So there's some kind of gaps needs to be achieved within the next 10 years. So I think with all of those kind of detail, there are three main questions I want to touch today. So how are the near and long-term goals linked? And are they consistent with limiting global temperature change to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And also, how can the international climate pledges and the national development priorities, how can they converge? So I'm pulling one chart from actually a synthesis report we led together with Energy Foundation China that was released last December, and it is actually a multi-institution, multi-modeling team effort on this a really large, long report looking at China's new growth pathway towards carbon neutrality. So on this chart, it shows kind of the total or net carbon dioxide emission pathways that coming from major modeling team, like from worldwide, including Chinese modeling team and international modeling team. So if you look at the 1.5 degree compatible pathways, I think what the model agrees, what they don't agree, I think actually most of them agrees on the time of reaching net zero, actually between 2050 and 2080, but I think the majority of them agrees on the earlier kind of the range, like by 2050 to be consistent with 1.5. I think there's only 2 lines actually spread into the later net zero year. And also, if you look at the 2030, the near term kind of trend, actually all the model have immediate kind of emission reduction after 2020. So really, there's no much room for continued growth in a 1.5 degree world. So peaking early is actually a very important element if China wants to be compatible with a 1.5 degree temperature goal. Another really nice diagram I'm pulling out from this report is actually making a point that carbon neutrality is actually essential to address climate change, but it's actually not only about climate change. There's a much more broad impacts and benefits that can be achieved associated with a carbon neutral China. It can clean the air and improve public health, also improve the quality of people's life with better quality of jobs, and also spark technological innovation and also creating new economic opportunities for a more sustained long-term growth for China. So it's actually linked to very different elements of this vision. And then I think how are we going to get there? So I think another policy brief we put together is looking at what are the key decarbonization strategies that can get us to net zero emissions. The first one is to promoting sustainable demand in the end use sectors. So that including more efficient energy use and also structural change, urban planning, and also kind of changing of lifestyle. That's all blended into that first strategy. And also decarbonizing electricity generation. And for China, that's mostly is focusing on coal phase out because that's dominating on the fossil fuel side for the power system. And then electrifying end use like hydrogen or biofuel in transportation and industry. Some of the activities are really challenging to be electrified. We have like other low carbon fuels for that switch. And then, oh, sorry, kind of mixed up with my point. So electrifying the end use and then some difficult, challenging to be electrified, we use the low carbon fuel for those activities. And then sequestering carbon either through the natural system like land use change, and then some of the carbon capture and storage technologies. That's all the strategy to reach zero carbon emission, but also to address 1.5. I think the non-CO2s are also very important. So there's more targeted in the agriculture and building sector for some of the non-CO2 reductions. I think I want to dive into maybe a little bit on the coal question for China, because that's absolutely very important and also a big challenge for China. So I'm pulling out this kind of global coal power capacity pie chart by region, and you can see China has the world's largest coal fleet, and actually larger than all the other countries combined is 52% by 2020. Another layer of the challenge is Chinese coal plants are much younger than what's operating in the OECD regions. If you look at the US and EU, their plants are implemented during 1970s and 80s. So those plants are already reaching the end of their design lifetime by now. But if you look at China and also India, they have much younger fleets, and China coal plants, majority are implemented after 2005. They still have a couple of decades kind of remaining lifetime as designed. So that's kind of adding another layer of this challenge. And also we also find actually the coal capacity is still growing in China. And this map, all the gray dots here are the operating plants. There are over 1,000 of them by the end of 2020. But also we kind of identify some of the plants that are under construction, which are the red dots, and also getting permitted, which is receiving the official approval from the government. That's the yellow dots. So there are together about 15% increase in capacity. That's kind of a potential in the pipeline that we may expect to see during the next 5 years. Some other estimates will see even more projects that are at early stages. Those are kind of more uncertain whether they're going to be implemented or not. But also kind of a background information in the past kind of 2 decades, you can see the bars indicate China's total coal capacity has been growing. Coal power generation has been growing, but at a slower speed. Because if you look at the plant's average utilization, which is the purple line, that's have a clear declining trend, kind of indicating there's a overcapacity issue here. They keep building those coal plants, but generation haven't been keep up with the speed. And the coal plants utilization had been declining, and the main kind of outcome of that is like the half of the plants are actually running at a loss. And with the continued coal builds, actually the capacity I kind of indicated as like a lighter color in the bars, it may keep growing, but that's gonna cause the utilization level keep declining and further exacerbating the financial difficulty of the industry. So aside of the climate change mitigation motivation, only the economic, some of the economic motivation may like show this is not logistic it's not reasonable to do this continued coal build. So no new coal is actually a very important element in the near-term action for China. I think I will also want to discuss some of the thinking about a high ambition coal phase out in China. If we stop all the new plants in the pipeline, but what about the existing one? We already see there are over 1,000 of them. How can we structure a high ambition coal phase out that also balancing other societal objectives for China? I already mentioned many of the majority of them are really kind of young in terms of the vintage age. So I kind of we have this 5-pillar framework that we think about this question, where we evaluate each single one of the coal plants' performance using multiple criteria in terms of their technical attributes, profitability, and environmental impact, that including the local environmental impacts. So we are evaluating the performance of the individual coal plants. And we're also evaluating some of the potential impacts that may get from this coal phase out, that including grid stability, but also some of the equity issue, including stranded assets and employment. Those are big issue for China because of the magnitude, but also the kind of the characteristic of the coal fleet. So I won't go into detail of this research, but I just want to give you some high level conclusion we have. So with all the existing coal plants that are colored in kind of a different application of the coal plants, and we actually developed the coal phase-out pathway for individual provinces, and we're seeing if we want to kind of reduce the impact on stranded assets, reduce the impact on employment, we may want to just guarantee some minimum lifetime for those coal plants between 20 to 30 years. That's the minimum they can operate. And then gradually reduce their utilization level, which means more of them can stay online without creating too much trouble on stranded assets, but they need to reduce the utilization level to be able to in line with a 1.5 degree pathway. And with that, coal will change their role in the power system from baseload generation to actually provide some peaking services that also helps to integrate renewable into the grid. So I think with that, I want to close my talk, actually mention the climate partnership and leadership piece that actually Todd already mentioned in his talk. Because if people remember, this is all of these bilateral, multilateral climate agreement in advance Paris Agreement actually built a very successful path towards the final negotiation. And among those, the joint climate announcement between the United States and China actually provided a very important catalytic effect to the international climate action and raised the expectation for a more ambitious Paris outcome back then. So I do think this year is very critical and has the opportunity to reestablish this climate leadership and partnership between the two countries, but also including India and EU, that those larger economies that we have guest speaker on the panel as well. So with that, I will kind of close my talk and happy to take questions in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryna. I would just remind our audience that we will take questions through the question and answer area. We're not going to really use the chat area. So please feel free to submit those. We'll discuss them at the end. Okay, so thank you again for your presentation. I would now go on and ask Navroz Dubash, who is of the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, where I believe it's after midnight, and we thank you again for your kind and continuously lucid presentation, even at that hour. So we were talking as we were experiencing some of the snafus with the technical side, and we know that you're in for a treat with his presentation. He is a professor at the Center for Policy Research, was instrumental in establishing the Global Climate Action Network in 1990. He's a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment, and he's been a member of the Scientific Advisor Group of the UN Climate Action Summit. Thank you very much, and welcome also to the presentation, to our webinar. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Todd. I'm really glad to join this great group with a lot of old friends and some new ones. I thought I would use the time that I have to give you a little bit of a snapshot of Indian climate politics and policy, and I've titled this "Beyond Climate Opportunism." And that'll become clear in a minute. What I'm going to do is just sort of go through 3 points, starting with this idea of climate opportunism as a way of thinking through sort of one of the founding, the questions you posed really, which is what is the scope for ambition? Then talk a little bit about net zero And I'm going to be a little iconoclastic here and push back a bit on net zero and ask if through an Indian lens, this unitary, increasingly unitary narrative is really the most productive way to think about where we have to go. And then talk about India's sort of checkered history here as a climate leader and in fact at times a climate laggard and what we can expect. So to begin with, much as Ryna did, I'm just going to give a quick overview of where we stand with India's current NDC pledges. So there are three quantitative pledges that India made. The first is a all of economy emissions intensity pledge, and this was 33 to 35% below 2005 levels by 2030. Now in India, we often joke that in India our target setting is normally with the China plus 10 rule. So whatever China does, we do with sort of a lag of 10 years or a subtraction of stringency of the target, and that's kind of the rule of thumb. And this intensity target actually was not that far off China's with that 10 adjustment. The second is a power sector target of 40% non-fossil fuel share of our power capacity by 2030. And I'll talk in a second about whether that's a big number or a small number. And then finally, a carbon sink pledge as well. Now, where I'm going to throw a few graphs at you, not too many. And this is a particularly complex, probably the most complex one, but I only want you to take a couple of things from this. What does all this add up to and what is it likely to add up to? So this graph basically shows 2030 emission levels against various assumptions of GDP growth rates. And this is a scatter plot of all the various models that were around at the time of Paris and a couple of years after. So it's 15 odd scenarios. And as you can see, they're all over the place. Now those tram lines, the red tram lines there are the Paris targets, the NDC pledge I just showed you, the intensity pledge, right? It's two lines because it's 33 to 35%. And what you can see is that there are a bunch of scenarios that project us being above, a bunch that project us being below, and a whole bunch right on the money, as it were. And essentially what we did is we unpacked these pledges, and the purple cluster here is the one I want to focus you on, which are national policies circa 2015. And what they basically suggest is India is going to largely hit its NDC pledge. So in other words, India is more or less on track to meet its 2030 pledge based on policies that are on the books now. There's a lot of discussion in India that Climate Action Tracker and other such independent bodies say that not only is India meeting its pledge, but also has a pledge that is close to consistent with 2 degrees and perhaps even, if not entirely 1.5, then better than other countries. So there's a lot of sort of self-satisfaction about that in the narrative. The big story, though, that for our purpose here that I want to emphasize is that nobody is saying, none of these models are saying that India's emissions will not continue to grow through 2030. But the amount that they will grow is not sort of analogous to what China did over the last 10 or 15 years, right? So India is going to grow, but probably not break the carbon bank. So that also shapes how we think about politics in India. So these are relatively, these are sort of par for the course kind of pledges, right? They're not going to be, they're not going to dramatically shift in global politics, neither are they deeply inadequate. But what I would like to convince you of is that, and again, I'm not going to take you through this detailed table, but I'm going to flag a couple of things. What I want to convince you of is the fact that in India, these pledges are actually not really the main story. So I often find it useful to think of countries having different climate politics, and in very crude, broad, binary terms, there are countries where targets kind of are used as an instrument of ambition and they lead action. And there are countries like India where the targets essentially follow domestic policies and they follow action. And India is definitely a case where our sectoral measures, our domestic policies are actually a whole lot more ambitious than what we choose to pledge globally. So we are an over-compliance country, right? We are a country that's almost designed to over-comply with our pledges. So the point is, you need to look below the hood, under the pledge, to see what's actually going on. So This is a table that was derived from our biennial update report. I'm just going to pick up a couple of examples. That first row there is the national solar mission, and the second row is the wind energy mission. Now, between them, the promise was 175 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's actually a pretty big number because our total grid is around 290 or 300 gigawatts, right? So India has already put in place about 90 odd gigawatts, which is 25% of our current capacity. And renewables now accounts for 10% of generation. So that's actually pretty good in a short amount of time. Of course, there's still a lot of coal. It's 75% of generation. But if you think back to the NDC pledge, which was 40% of capacity will come from renewable energy. If you include large hydro in that, India is already at 38%, right? So India is very close to meeting its power sector pledge for 2030 today, right? So that's the bad news in that the pledge is not that ambitious. The good news is a bunch of domestic stuff that we're already doing is actually going to lead us further down that road. We're going to overcomply. And there's several other things in here. I'll just flag a couple. There's a really innovative LED rollout and subsidy program that has got a lot of traction and other such things. Most of these things have been driven not by mitigation, but they've been driven by various domestic opportunities and openings. In the case of solar, the initial opening was energy security. And so that takes me to what I want to kind of leave you with in terms of this first part of the talk about what I think drives the domestic politics of climate change in India. And it's really opportunism. It's not mitigation urgency. Because mitigation tends to run into the climate equity arguments that those of us who followed climate change for a long time know only too well. The fact that there's a presumption that mitigation is always economically costly. We now know that's not necessarily the case. And that's one reason why, in fact, the politics has shifted. But if it is presumed that it's costly, then if we take on mitigation commitments, it means it's at the cost of our development. And that narrative continues to be very strong. A second driver is geopolitical aspirations. India aspires to a Security Council seat to kind of move into the big boys club. And we have faced rounds of pressure before Copenhagen, before Paris, and so on and so forth. And that has led to the creation of various institutions, which are in part kind of performative institutions. They're there as shells, but every now and then something really creative happens within those shells, like, for example, our mission on solar power. There is a growing realization of climate impacts, and that drives politics somewhat, but it's deeply subordinate to immediate development concerns. That is not what shifts domestic politics. I would argue the biggest factor is a growing acceptance of the co-benefits point. So energy security, air pollution are also helped by mitigation. Things like congestion in cities are helped by public transport. And there is a growing appreciation of an economic opportunity story, that future economic opportunities are going to be driven by things like battery technology, electric vehicles, and these are all areas India needs to start thinking about with an industrial strategy approach. But at the moment, it's a bit of a mixed bag. So, for example, India's COVID rescue package promoted renewable energy at the same time as it promoted coal privatization, right? So it's still a bit of a mixed bag. So climate opportunism has taken us a fair way, and the question is it going to be enough in the future, right? So that's kind of where we've come from in a sense. Now, to turn to where we might be going, I think we're entering a world, and this was part of the questions Todd posed to us to consider, this sort of question about this year with the Glasgow COP. There has been this kind of drum roll of a drum roll around the idea of net zero, right? So a net zero world by 2050 has become a default benchmark, really propagated substantially by the IPCC report. It's sort of served as a focal point as a narrative. And we have recently seen, just in the last few weeks, the president-elect of COP has showed up in India. John Kerry has made statements saying, our country is going to basically, including India, come on board with a net zero target. And we haven't had that conversation very much in India, to be honest. There isn't analysis that's been done. But the little bit that has been done has some very contradictory messages about what net zero actually implies for India. So I've popped these two graphs down there. The first on the left panel there, is from the recent IEA's India Energy Outlook. So it's just a simple emissions versus time, and the shaded area is actual historic emissions. And these are three scenarios they draw out. So notice that the two top scenarios basically has India increasing its emissions way off into 2050 and beyond. This scenario, the lowest one, the so-called sustainable development scenario, has India declining, basically peaking right now. And this scenario has India reaching net zero sometime around the decade of the 2060s. Okay, so well beyond when sort of the narrative would have us being net zero. What's interesting about this is, how feasible is it for India to peak right now? So to try and answer that question, I've just stuck this very common human development index versus energy graph that, you know, we see lots of these around. And India is down here somewhere. And basically what it says, what it implies, is that India has to increase its energy needs by quite a bit before it gets to, you know, sort of a decent quality of living, even close to China or the rest of the industrialized world. So India has a lot of energy needs. At the moment, we are still a largely carbon-based energy society, like most of us. So how we can peak right away is really unclear. So in other words, a net zero narrative, a net zero ask of India will almost certainly arouse the sort of zero-sum language that India is being made to prematurely curtail its development because the rest of the world has been profligate. That is undoubtedly the kind of political language that net zero will arouse. And so I personally really think that alternative narratives may yield greater mitigation in India, and the net zero narrative is politically a very hard sell in India. So what do I mean by different narratives? And this is, I've just got one more slide after this, Todd. So I'll try and make sure I stay within time. So what do I mean by alternative narratives? Well, I think that looking at this problem from an through an Indian lens, you know, there's scope for sort of more plural climate frames. What's very interesting is all the modeling studies that one sees for India actually show that the real bang for your buck that you get in terms of what explains future emissions is not mitigation policies. It's actually development pathways. It's choices about industrialization. It's choices about urbanization and the resultant energy demand patterns. You know, do you build your cities around public transport? And essentially what I'm arguing is that climate politics probably looks quite different in countries that are yet to build much of its infrastructure, right? The language is really not so much about how do you decline, because you're almost certainly going to grow. The language is about how do you avoid locking into a high carbon future. So it's an avoided emissions frame. And my worry is that if there's international pressure on India around net zero, we might just say yes, because we sort of have to. But it'll be tokenist, right? And what is driving the politics, what has been positive about climate change in India in the last decade has actually been sectoral transition narratives. How do we build out our electricity sector in ways that takes care of energy security, for example, and air pollution? That has driven change, much more so than mitigation. So I sort of wonder whether, and I'm deviating a bit here from just a story about India, whether, you know, looking forward, a more kind of portfolio approach to future NDCs. So allow countries to give a bunch of things. Long-term targets for sure, net zero in some cases, something else in other cases, some interim targets, some sectoral transition plans, and some story about institutional development. And this is a sort of a pet peeve of mine, that we talk about long-term targets in many countries, and yet most countries don't actually have an institutional structure that helps tell everybody and helps figure out what that long-term target actually means for the decision one makes today, and what do you do with the winners and losers from those decisions. So in a sense, India is well placed to try and tell a story that says, look, yes, we have an ambition gap, as Todd said in his introductory story, but we also have an implementation gap. And if everybody tells us promises about the future without telling us what exactly they're going to do tomorrow, it might really be a problem. And India has been pretty good about telling us what you're going to do tomorrow. So the question is, can we leverage this in some ways into sort of a leadership story? So let me just quickly go through these. Now, India has a long history of being a laggard in climate politics. There's a really infamous picture, which I wish I'd thought to put up here, of the India and the EU jousting on the floor at Durban in the waning hours of the COP, with a huddle of people around them, hoping that they would come to some sort of agreement. We've left that behind, in part because we have changed the way we talk about things. I don't think we've changed the policies that much. And fortunately for India's reputation, unfortunately for the rest of the world and for all of us, of course, global climate politics moved backwards during the Trump years, not just because of Trump, but also Bolsonaro in Australia and so on and so forth. So India suddenly, everybody needed somebody who sounded friendly, and India was there to play that role. But I think that the ground is kind of shifting on India now. What India has been adept at doing is a lot of symbolic leadership. So we've put out things like the International Solar Alliance, this Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and so on and so forth. These things have not been that effective, but they've been useful diplomatic tools. What's going to happen in 2021? Well, India has a number of irons in the fire. We continue to be part of the basic countries. We're also part of this curious construct called the like-minded developing countries. And I always feel that you have an alliance that has to proclaim in its title that it's like-minded. We should be asking some hard questions about exactly what holds it together. But that's a topic for another day. We have historically worked very closely with China. We are in the middle of a 2 or 3 years of the worst regional tension we have faced for a couple of decades with China. There's a real freeze going on. Biden's America, we are waiting to see how much climate figures on the list of things that Biden brings to the table. It's quite possible that, at least from an Indian perspective, what America says about domestic politics, issues like Kashmir, issues like China relationships, trade relationships, all the other components of a bilateral relationship, those things may all sort of become traded off with a climate story. So I don't think we can expect a clear signal on climate in that bilateral relationship. We'll have to sort of wait and see. And finally, I think that one area that is underexplored is that India could really play a role in telling stories about transitions with other countries. So just transition around coal-dependent areas. How do we do a technology transition to decarbonize electric industry? So I think this is the sort of slightly more modest role for India as a middle power that I see as being most productive. Let me end it there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Navroz. I think in particular, your discussion of the importance of sectoral transitions and that narrative is a good segue to just mention that our next presentation on March 25th will be on the view from some economic sectors. I think you make very good points also about net zero and how that has become the sort of de facto international target. And in fact, it may have adverse domestic effects, picking such an ambitious target that may be difficult for many countries to meet. But let us turn now for the last presentation before we will open up for discussion to Professor Miranda Schreurs, who is at Technical University of Munich, where she is the director of the Environmental Policy Research Center and has been a professor of comparative politics in also at Free University of Berlin. Her work focuses on policy projects examining the energy transitions in Germany and Japan, climate policies of Europe, the United States, and China, and the politics of high-level radioactive waste disposal. She was appointed in 2011 by Chancellor Angela Merkel as a member of the German Ethics Commission on a Safe Energy Supply. And it's also getting late for you in Munich, and we thank you very much for joining us and look forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Todd. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I am going to start by screen sharing here. Okay, so as you correctly mentioned, the plan here is to talk about Germany and the European Union. And I will jump right in. So I wanted to just quickly point out that historically, the European Union was, of course, a major contributor to global CO2 emissions. And if you go all the way up into the 1960s, the contribution of the European Union was really substantial. The United States became an increasingly important contributor to greenhouse gas emissions as well. But you can see that in recent years, the contribution of Europe has been declining, and the mix is changing so that increasingly China and India and other parts of Asia and the developing world are becoming much, much larger aspects of the question. So I'm going to jump super quickly here and start with the European Union and then go into the situation of Germany. So I'm starting by not talking about Europe, but by the IPCC, because this report had quite a lot of impact in Germany. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their special report on 1.5 degrees. And it was pretty clear that globally we were not on track for the 1.5 degree target. And the amount of emission reductions that would be needed were very substantial. And at the same time, there was a United Nations emissions gap report that basically pointed the finger at the G20 countries as the largest emitters, also saying we're not on track, ambition levels need to be raised. So also just as a little bit of background, the European Union is, in terms of CO2 emissions on a per capita basis, substantially below the United States. Nevertheless, it's still well above where we need to be if we're talking about a 2 degree world and or even a 1.5 degree world. India is basically at the level of what we're talking about if we're talking about a global world of 1.5 degrees centigrade. So that really gives you an idea of what needs to be done. The European Union has introduced a series of policies that go back much before this one. The policy that just finished up was called the 2020 framework. And I always liked it because you could say Europe's policy for 2020 compared to 1990 was 20-20-20 by 2020. 20% greenhouse gas emission reductions, 20% renewables, 20% energy efficiency improvements. The targets for 2030 were set in 2014, and those targets were 40% reduction, 27% renewables, and 27% energy efficiency. But when those reports came out in 2018 to show that we're really not on track, the EU upped its targets and said, well, we're going to aim for 32% renewables in 2030 and also to enhance energy efficiency. The European Union has been introducing a whole series of policies that speak very nicely to what Navroz Dubash was just saying, that in Europe also, there's really a push now to see how can we link the discussions about what needs to be done for climate change with the issues that most people care about, which are things like, am I going to have a job, and how are we going to do economically compared to other parts of the world? And so a variety of different policies have been introduced. In 2018, the same year all those other reports came out, the European Commission released a plan called the Clean Planet for All. It's sort of the beginning of Europe's vision for a modern, competitive, prosper, climate neutral economy. And what you see here are the elements of a program that has taken further steps forward in recent years, focused on energy efficiency, renewables, a shift in the mobility sector, the circular economy, because if you don't also address resource use, you're never going to get to the climate change targets we're talking about, and thinking about what kinds of technologies we might need to get there. Most recently, since 2019, has been the movement towards a policy that is Europe's Green Deal. I put Europe's Green New Deal just to help Americans think about the contrast with what has been talked about there. In Europe, there is a Green Deal program, and it is an accepted program. The European Green Deal calls for climate neutrality for all EU 27 countries. England, of course, is no longer there. It used to be 28. By 2050, a circular economy is to be reached. And this includes in areas that are hard to deal with sectors, like the cement industry or the steelmaking industry. And here the big question is, what can be done to tackle those big emitting sectors that have been totally dependent on fossil fuels? Can we shift to green hydrogen and much more use of batteries and reusable batteries and recyclable materials? Building renovation, the goal is to double, maybe triple renovation rate of buildings, so that basically all buildings, whether old or new, are built in such a way that they are energy neutral. In the future, you won't be able to build here unless you're building climate neutral and building renewables into your buildings. A target of zero pollution by 2050. So it's also tackling other areas outside of climate change, knowing that a lot of these targets are interrelated in some ways. Ecosystem and biodiversity, agricultural sector is going to be tackled. Transport, although here the target is somewhat weaker than you might expect for a program that is looking for a 2050 climate neutrality, but nevertheless an effort to enhance the efficiency of the transport sector, and to build in this concept of a just transition, which is something I think also the Joseph Biden administration is doing in the US, a big new focus. I think it's a new element in the approach to climate change in the US, which is to really focus on what does it mean when we're shifting away from fossil fuels and moving more towards renewables. And I'll give you an example of this for Germany shortly. Very, very interesting, especially for academics, is that 35% of EU research funds are now to be targeted at climate-friendly technologies and research projects. That's huge. That basically means that the entire European research community is going to be asked to work on this problem. And there's a discussion about introducing a carbon border tax. So I'm now going to quickly jump to Germany, and Germany is an interesting case to look at. It's about 1/5 of European greenhouse gas emissions, about 1/5 of the economy. And back in the 1960s, the German economic miracle was based on two main sources of energy. One was coal. Germany is a country with a huge amount of lignite and had a substantial amount of hard coal. In the meantime, the hard coal has been largely mined. There's still a huge amount of lignite, which is a particularly dirty form of coal. The second thing Germany embarked on in the 1960s is nuclear power. And I bring this into the discussion today because I noticed that in the United States, to some extent in India and China, although less so, there's also a discussion of, well, don't we need nuclear energy for dealing with climate change? And in Germany, that is not an accepted approach. Partly already in the 1970s, huge demonstrations against the building of nuclear power plants. A lot of that has to do with Cold War politics and the concern that if you have nuclear energy, it could be transformed into uses for nuclear weapons. Although many nuclear power plants were built, there basically was an increasingly conflictual relationship between people who didn't want the nuclear power plants and the industry that was pursuing it with the support of the government. Unification, you have to remember Germany's got a really interesting history. These parts of Germany were part of the Eastern Bloc, and there were a group of nuclear power plants in the East. But when Germany reunified in 1990, these power plants were all immediately shut down because they were considered not to be safe enough. You also have to understand that Germany is a parliamentary system, and something that really shifted politics in Germany was the emergence of the Green Party, which is a party that was emerging around the anti-nuclear movement. So they emerged in the late 70s and first made it into the German parliament in 1983. And in 1986, you had the Chernobyl nuclear accident. So that basically strengthened the power of the Green Party that had been saying nuclear power is not a good idea. In the meantime, basically no new nuclear power plants were built. And after the Fukushima nuclear accident, I was also involved in a committee that was set up to say, okay, it's clear that nuclear power is going to be eliminated in Germany. What does that mean? So this ethics commission for a secure energy future was established to look at the question of what does Fukushima mean for Germany? And basically, the decision was it means a nuclear phase out as rapidly as possible. Germany at one time had 30% of its nuclear fleet powering the electricity sector. As of 2022, the last of the nuclear power plants are to be shut down. So right after Fukushima, 8 nuclear power plants were taken from the list of operable nuclear power plants. And since then, a number of other nuclear power plants have been shut down. Now, I mention all of that partly because I'm involved in this, but partly because one concern we have is that people who are talking about nuclear as an answer to climate change are forgetting the very serious problem of what do we do with the nuclear waste. And that's a committee that I'm involved in, dealing with Germany's struggle to find a location for high-level radioactive waste. The other reason for talking so much about nuclear just now is that you can't understand Germany's approach to climate change without understanding that the whole transition began as an anti-nuclear transition. And that the decision to go into renewable energy was a decision to basically replace nuclear in the electricity mix with renewables. So the push began quite early, much earlier than in many other countries, and it's been a very successful push. In 1990, Germany had 3% of its electricity from renewables. And today, it's, especially in 2020, this is only showing 2019, in 2020, with the slowdown in the economic activities, it was hitting 45% of the electricity mix. So Germany has shown that as the, I think now 4th largest economy in the world, maybe 5th, it is possible to run your economy largely on, at least your electricity system, largely on renewables. The big question that remained was the coal. Germany was highly dependent on coal. And one concern is that although we were doing a lot to get renewables into the system, we weren't doing enough to get coal out of the system. Before I go there real quickly, a second really big issue for Germany is how do we get more renewables into the sectors that have not changed so much? So the electricity sector is well on target. It's actually beyond target in terms of switching into the renewables. But this hasn't been the case so much for the heating sector, the cooling sector, or the transport sector. And so these are the big areas that will be targeted or need to be targeted in the future. Now, when you look at what happened with Germany's emissions, 1990 was the year of German unification. And you'll notice a pretty strong drop in emissions in the first few years of the 1990s. About half of that drop you have to credit to the drop of economic activity in the East and the shutdown of many of the old East German plants that weren't very effective, weren't modernized. So this is what you would call hot air if you were looking at many of the Soviet economies, the rapid dimension of CO2 emission reductions because of the economic slowdown. But basically since then, there's been a series of different policies and programs that have contributed to the emission reductions that you see here. And a lot of that really is the development of the renewable energies and some energy efficiency improvements. Now notice that the drop here is quite sharp. And this is partly because Germany had set a target to reduce its emissions by 40% of 1990 levels by 2020. And if you look at where they were in 2018, it was not really yet at that place where it needed to be. And in Germany, as all other European countries, if you don't meet your targets, you get fined by the European Union. So there was a lot of concern about the costs of non-compliance. So a decision was made to start looking into the shutting down of the coal-fired power plants. The unusually large drop it was unexpected, and it's the corona impact. So in the end, Germany won't be financially penalized for not meeting target because it did meet target, although it was not totally because of the effort to get coal out of the system. In 2018-19, a decision was made that we needed a coal commission. This was basically a commission that was introduced, bringing together industry, politicians, and consumer groups, environmental groups to say, okay, Germany is talking about being a climate leader, and yet we're not doing enough to get CO2 emissions to drop because we haven't tackled the coal industry yet. This committee met for over a year, and they finally came up with a compromise plan, which is to phase out nuclear, to phase out coal, just like we phased out nuclear in the past, and to do it by 2038. Environmentalists say that's too late. Industry says it's too fast. The way that industry was finally brought into the program was through a compensation plan. Those areas that are coal manufacturing areas, coal mining areas, will be substantially compensated in order to deal with the shift and the loss of jobs that will come from the coal plant shutdowns. And I'm about to finish, but I just wanted to show you two pictures. I was walking back to my office in the fall of 2019, and this is the scene that I saw. My office is right next to this. This is the Fridays for Future meeting in Germany, basically saying, we're not doing enough yet on climate change, we need to do more. And I actually had the honor to talk to these people. I got to speak on the platform. It's the largest talk I've ever given. There were 17,000 people estimated there. And it was all to say, it is a big, big, serious problem. We need to take it seriously. And although Germany likes to say it is a climate leader, no country right now is really a climate leader. We all need to do much more. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your exhortation to leadership very much. And thank you for sharing also the fact that the European Union charges punishments for nations not meeting their objectives, which seems to be much different than perhaps the rest of the world. So that may help us explain in part, if not leadership, at least advancement in the European Union, perhaps more than some of the other nations. But anyway, thank you very much. And I would like to, with just a few minutes that remain, open up for some questions. There are some questions posted. And I would like to also thank all of the panelists and all of those of you who were able to join us. And just a reminder that this series will continue, that if you registered for this one, you'll get announcements of the future webinars. And let me now just take a few questions if I can. So there's a question about emissions caused by fossil fuels that get exported outside of China, whether they get counted to China's net zero calculation. Let me group another couple of questions about China, which is its climate change goals and its newly announced 5-year plan, and how those might be part of the sort of outline of the agenda that you elaborated. Another question is where China will transition after the phase out of coal. I think that, part of the issue will also apply to some of the other nations of sort of, if India phase out coal as well, the United States phases out, coal and fracking, what will take its place? It seems that in Germany, renewables has done a good job. Couple of other questions. One question about whether the authors will send their slides later. I think the best way to access the slides, specifics of the presentations, will be to go to the website in about 3 days when we'll post the broadcast. So look for the broadcast, and I'll be sure and send that also to the panelists. YouTube broadcast that colleagues at the School of Public Affairs are going to help us gather. A couple of other questions. I think a question in terms of pollution, wouldn't it be better to have magnetic levitation rather than high-speed rail for trains? Another question is, why did Germany decide to completely abandon nuclear power rather than invest in innovation that is safer, like TerraPower? I guess I'll turn the floor back to the panelists and have them please sort of take those questions on. And I guess I would just, if I may, add another question, which is about if for Navroz, if net zero is a perhaps difficult target to meet for India, what would be an alternative way of setting concrete targets, but then also establishing, as you said, the institutional development pledge necessary to meet those? And I think that is a common problem. Certainly in the United States, we're in a presidential transition. We don't really have institutional development pledges per se. And that's part of the reason it's even difficult to cite exactly what the US ambition is. Right now, the US is trying to discern whether to reduce its emissions 70% from 2005 levels as Greenpeace advocates, 50% as World Resources Institute advocates. This is perhaps by 2030. And these are the goals. And the question is, what is really viable? I mean, and this is a problem probably for all of our cases, which is that, we have ambitions and then they're difficult to realize, with the possible exception of Germany, which seems to realize them in part perhaps because of the pandemic, but nonetheless seems to be meeting its goals. So I guess I would like to turn over for one more round of, just a couple of minutes to each of the panelists, and then given the lateness of the hour, especially in India and Germany, we should probably call it a day. But please, final words from each of the panelists. Maybe in the same order that we started.
Yeah, should I answer the question like in the chat? Yeah. I think in terms of counting the emissions, I feel like the fossil fuel, it's usually counted where they are consumed right now. So I don't think the export counted into China's target, but it's like actually where the fossil fuel are burned in terms of like territory. That's how they do the calculation right now. But also for China, I don't think there's a lot of export on coal. Because China produce a lot and they consume like domestically. That's it's not a major like a coal exporter. And in terms of the next 5-year plan for China, I think that the near term, the overall kind of framing is like a peaking before 2030, but there's no clear kind of for 2025 goal in the 5-year plan yet. But there will be more more detailed policy. Like it's not usually came in the first year of the 5-year plan. Like a more sectoral detailed 5-year plan will come out in about a year. So I think we can look at more maybe the renewable target in the 2025 timeframe will come out in about a few months. And I think in terms of the technology that will replace coal in the power system, I think the majority will be renewable, but I don't think there's nuclear or CCS technology will be out of the picture completely right now. So I think there some ambitious like a nuclear build up in China, but it still is like a very small portion of the total electricity system, and also they have the security concern. So I would say like maybe over 70% will definitely come from renewable, but I think because of the fossil like a coal in China's power system, I think CCS is not completely out of the picture right now. There's still some kind of effort making that a possibility in the future. So I think that I answered most of the China-related question, and really, really glad to hear all the insights from each of the panelists. And I agree a lot of the challenges are shared among the countries, and also the opportunities are as well, linking to the national development priority. I think we need to provide more evidence base to those type of narrative in this conversation. With that, I'll turn to other panelists, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. Navroz?
Yes, thanks so much, Todd. I did, in the interest of time, try and respond to a couple of questions that came through on the Q&A directly by typing in an answer. So that is there in the Q&A box. But let me address Todd's very good question. I think there's no doubt that the international. So Todd's question was really about what can and should India and countries that for which a net zero target may not work that well, what can they put on the table? And I think that actually I'm a kind of a fan of the Paris Agreement structure, because I think that it has kind of opened political spaces for countries to tell stories about how climate change matters in ways that work in the context of domestic politics. And that's why I think that keeping those spaces open is really, really important. And so what I would love to see from more countries is, as I tried to say in my talk, kind of a set of pledges that blend long-term perspective, what are sort of key sectors that require transition, and this sort of institutional point. And the institutional point, I think, is worth coming back to. As Todd said, even in the US, there isn't really sort of a credible and consistent voice on that authoritatively says, here's what the studies say. There isn't a sort of a single place where different interests can be brought together. In Germany, they do have this corporatist tradition of bringing together industry and civil society and government around, for example, the coal question. It's a really useful sort of construct. There are relatively few countries that have thought about how one has both credible and democratic and open decision-making around climate governance. The one, so China has a particular form that is quite hierarchical in its nature, and with a lot of sort of authority vested in those structures. But I think the most interesting model globally is the UK model, where they have actually passed legislation, and many countries are now passing legislation. But within that legislation, they've set up something called the Climate Change Committee in the UK, which doesn't have regulatory authority, but it has the authority to analyze what sectoral line departments are doing, put that information in the public domain, undertake studies such as a net zero study. And so they shape a conversation, and they have kind of an authoritative voice that helps act almost like an institutional ratchet on backsliding in the UK. It provides kind of a focal point for UK climate politics. For example, the Fridays for Future group in the UK has kind of used the Climate Change Committee's recommendations. So I think that is one kind of model that's really interesting. Just at a higher level, you know, in some of the work we've been doing on climate institutions, there are sort of three governance roles that are underperformed at the moment. One is the strategy setting, monitoring, review kind of role, such as the Climate Change Committee does. A second is a coordination role, right? So if climate change is in fact, you know, most countries don't have ministries of climate change per se. The work is kind of smeared across the institutional landscape. How is that coordinated? How is it coordinated vertically in federal countries? So there's a whole sort of coordination story here. And it's very interesting to see that the Biden administration is going down the road of kind of embedding climate, mainstreaming climate, if you like, into departments like transport and so on and so forth, which is interesting because it's sort of a scaled up version of what India did 10 years ago in a very modest way. The third governance role, so coordination, the strategy setting, and the third role is kind of a mediating politics role. If one sets a target and it's going to create losers, so let's take the French tax proposal and the Gilets Jaunes protest. What if there had been a body that actually sort of brought people together whose role it was to try and sort of anticipate and mediate a conflict between political winners and losers from climate policy? How does that mediation happen? So these are three sort of roles that I think need to be played. And it would be great if countries would put on the table the kinds of things they're trying to do to solve those governance challenges as part of their pledges.
Thank you. That's fascinating. That sounds like in fact, a new agenda for comparative politics.
Well, I can't help but seize the moment. So we have a special issue of environmental politics coming out, trying to sort of set the platform for that. And hopefully that'll come later in the year. It's a set of case studies. So please, those of you on the call, look out for that special issue.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. All right, Miranda, we would like to ask you for last comments.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for staying on and listening. It's nice to see the level of interest in this issue area. I see that several of the questions in the chat box actually have to do with technology and technology transitions. And I think that's actually one of the really exciting things about what is going on with climate change. A lot of what we hear about climate change is doom and gloom, and there's reason for that. But at the same time, it's a huge crisis with a lot of huge opportunities associated with it. And Germany is basically looking at its long-term future and saying, what can we do to be leaders in the new economy of the future? And that means looking at every single aspect of technology. So we have questions here about asphalt. There's a lot of research going on now. Can we turn our roads into solar power facilities? Why are we using road space just for roads? Why don't we use them for something else? And we can talk about This nuclear question, why is Germany not investing in new kinds of nuclear? Basically because the country has decided that it takes too long to develop new nuclear. We don't have that kind of time. And most countries that are pursuing nuclear are slow on making transitions with renewables. So there's just no appetite for nuclear in Germany. I think what we really see is an initiative to figure out how can we take the entire economy and move it in a new direction so that we go through not only the fourth, but maybe the fifth industrial revolution and turn our economies into green, clean, climate-friendly economies. So thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating to look at the roots of German environmentalism and to study possibilities for applying the lessons elsewhere, which at least in the United States, we haven't learned yet. But anyway, I want to thank all of our panelists. I am also asked by the School of Public Affairs to remind colleagues and those of you on this call that we host the William Riley Awards for Environmental Leadership every year. We are seeking nominations, so there is a link. If you have a colleague who has contributed especially to sort of environmental leadership issues, we have an award named after a former EPA administrator, William Riley. And so anyway, I just thought I would mention that. I'm sorry to interrupt the flow of the discussion, but I thank all of you for joining us at this late hour for some of you. And we look forward to furthering the dialogue. And again, thank you very much for your very insightful comments, panelists. Thank the audience. Thank you for staying with us, and have a great afternoon or morning, as the case may be. Thank you so much. Look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you also.
Thank you.
Thank you, Todd.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.